Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia Augmented Brass tutorial series. We're going to have a look at the synth engine today. There are 5 different synthesizer engines baked into Augmented Brass, quite a lot to go at today. If you're enjoying this series and would like to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. It's a brilliant way to do it. So here I've got my slightly amended default template sound, and this time I'm going to mute layer A, which is where the samples live. And so now we can just concentrate on part 1 of layer B. This is where our synth sound lives. I'm also going to disengage the filter and turn the chorus off so that this is a completely flat sound. All you're hearing now is the synthesizer itself, and I'll save that default preset so that I can get back here if I need to. I'm going to click on the word default and bring up the 5 synthesizer types. I'm going to start at the top and work down. The analog engine is a simple 3 oscillator engine. I'm going to load up the analog brass preset, and it sounds like this. That sound's generated with 3 oscillators. As you can see, they're all sawtooths. But here's an important point to note about the analog engine. What you see isn't actually what you get. The Augmented series by Arturia give you curated sounds. It's not designed to be a pure analog synthesizer engine. I can demonstrate this very easily. I'm going to turn 2 of the oscillators off. In fact, I'm going to turn all of the controls down to 0 and get myself a default volume, and I want no detune at all. So this is the simplest possible sound that this oscillator can generate. So we have a single sawtooth when I press a single note. What you see in the oscilloscope there is not a simple sawtooth. That's multiple sawtooths playing simultaneously. What's happening behind the scenes is that aspects of the oscillator engine that you can't see, that you don't have access to, are being used to give you a default sound. And these are the controls via which you can modulate that sound. In this particular case, we have multiple sawtooths operating simultaneously to generate this complex effect. And we can actually detune those waves. That's what the detune control is all about. If I press that single note down and increase detune, that's a function called unison detune, where you play multiple copies of the same wave, slightly out of pitch with each other, and what you hear there, that kind of pseudo-phasing effect, that's generated by multiple waves playing simultaneously. You can't see that, you don't have access to it. It's a baked-in part of the preset. Even the fundamental pitch of the oscillators can't be taken for granted. So here I'll play a simple C, and you can see that's operating at 130 Hertz. I've jumped back into the presets, and now I'm going to load up Little Broken Organ, and I'm going to set all of the controls to what they were in the previous. I can't remember if it was up or down, but it doesn't matter. In the previous preset, so now this should sound exactly the same as the previous preset, simply by choosing a different engine. I've set all of those characteristics absolutely identically, I think. Now I'm going to press the same note on the keyboard, but now we're getting a note 1 octave lower. That happens to be a characteristic of that particular preset. So the trick with the analog engine is to pick the sound that's closest to your starting point, your baseline of what you want the sound to be like. That's a pretty nice sort of pad sound to start with, and then start playing with the controls. Speaking of the controls, let's finally get round to having a look at them. So we've got 3 independent oscillators here. Oscillator 1 is the fundamental sound. You don't even have like an independent volume control for it, because really that's the master volume itself. Then we have 2 secondary oscillators that can be brought in to taste. So if I bring oscillators 2 and 3 down. So here's our basic oscillator 1 sound. Again, multiple triangles being played against each other. Then we bring in the second oscillator, which also happens to be a triangle, clearly detuned by an octave. And then oscillator 3 is going to be the square, and that's up at least 1 octave, maybe 2. The combination of those 3 sounds together is what makes the mechanism preset. Let's bring in some noise. And frequency modulation. This is not a very slow undulating frequency modulation that you're going to hear as vibrato. It's going to be very So that's modulating the pitch of these oscillators hundreds of times a second, and you get this very unique characteristic sound of what we call FM as opposed to frequency modulation. They're both exactly the same thing, but they kind of describe different terms. FM is a very sort of 80s Yamaha DX7 sort of sound. You've already seen detune, offsetting all of those pitches of the various oscillators against each other. It generates a really complex sound at very small values. So detune goes all the way up to 100. But generally speaking, single figures is where you want to be to get a really subtle, nice sound without it sounding too dissonant. So that's pretty nice. But if you push it a bit further, it is going to start sounding actually out of tune already. And now, you know, we're into sound effects territory. Well, as soon as we got to above 5 or 6, we were in a completely different sonic world. Second synth engine on the list is Granular. Strange old monster, granular synthesis. Let's load up the Big Bell preset. The best way to think about granular synthesis is that you're looking at this sample through some binoculars, through a window, and the center of the vision, the center of the thing that you're looking at is the clearest. That's where you're going to hear the sound at its most pure. But as you approach the outer limits of your periphery, if you think when you look through binoculars, the outer edge of the vision is very often blurred. That's exactly what you get with these windows on samples. They're called windows in the sampling function behind the scenes. And the thing that results from looking through this window is a grain. So we're going to get this kind of little moment of time that's going to scan very quickly through the sample. The easiest way to visualize grains, I'm just going to turn this density knob down to 1 and turn my size up to a millisecond. Watch this black line when I press a single note. So this is our tiny window looking at this sample. We're playing the sample back, but we're playing it in a very kind of restrained way, looking through this strange window. But when we start introducing more than one playhead, we're starting to listen to multiple different parts of the sample at the same time. So now if I increase the density to 2, density is how many playheads, how many grains are in existence at any given time. Now you've got 2 different playheads passing through that sample with a complex interaction between them. So you're hearing those 2 different things, and sometimes, as you heard, one was going forwards and one was going backwards. The more we increase density, this effect gets increasingly dramatic. So now there's 28 individual playheads, 28 grains in existence at any given time. Each one of those grains exists for this amount of time, 915 milliseconds, which means you're getting a very natural representation of the sample. You're hearing significant chunks of it. Every time one of those grains kicks off, you're hearing nearly a full second of the sample. As we bring that sound down, it's going to get increasingly artificial as these windows of vision on the sample get smaller and smaller. Now you hear it starting to break up because each individual playhead is only lasting for 100 milliseconds, and our brain is having to piece all of these sounds together to reconstruct the thing behind the scenes. If we keep going, it gets to the point where it's becoming pretty much impossible to actually identify the original sample, and instead you start hearing a very distorted, kind of broken view. The envelope shape is what the window looks like. How blurred are the edges of this thing? Now down at 0, it's a rectangular window, which means every time the sample playback starts and stops, it's brutal. It immediately begins playing from 0 to maximum, and it's going to play for a period of time, or whatever this size is set to, 40 milliseconds, and then it's just going to disappear immediately, which means it's going to sound very distorted. And as we start increasing the envelope shape, we basically smooth these edges. We use a thing called a window function to smooth the edges of the beginning and the end of the sample playback to make it sound less harsh. Grain effects is a filtering effect, so we're going to get a filter sweep. You can see in the spectrum analyzer below basically all of the frequencies of the wave are being picked up and moved forwards. So effectively they're being pitch shifted, but because the entire wave is being pitch shifted, what you get is a higher frequency version of the same fundamental sound. It's easier to visualize in the spectrum analyzer actually what grain effects is doing. It's actually moving the entire wave forwards through the frequency spectrum. Next along we have Harmonic. This is an additive synthesizer, so now instead of subtractive synthesis, where we use filtering to cut away sections of the sound, additive synthesizers use harmonics, sine waves, pure sine waves, to construct a sound from scratch. Now, generally speaking, building waves using individual sine waves is incredibly tedious. I used to own a Kawai K5 in the 1980s, I think, late 80s, early 90s, and you actually built your sounds with individual sine waves. It was just an absolutely unusable monster. What harmonic synthesis is much better at doing is giving you templates of harmonics to play with, and that's what we have. So if I choose the Dusty Thruster preset, because it's a brilliant name, and just increase the volume a bit because it's a bit quiet. So what you're getting there is 256 sine waves. A partial is an individual sine wave. In additive terms, they're called partials, but they are just harmonics, just sine waves. And they're all mathematically related. We can choose the ratio of odd harmonics to even harmonics. Odd harmonics are primarily the characteristics of square and triangle waves. Even harmonics don't generally tend to appear in analog sounds, but we add even harmonics to generate a sawtooth wave, so they're the more complex of the harmonics. If you play 100% odd and 100% even, you're effectively getting the same sound because the ratio of those harmonics is consistent throughout the entire wave. But the moment you start interacting odd harmonics with even harmonics, that's where you get your interesting stuff. So generally speaking, parity somewhere in the middle is going to be good. The morph knob gives us, this is another one of these things where most of the heavy duty work is done in the back end. These are two different filters that are applied to these sounds to just make them sound interesting. Again, we've started with a preset here. We've started with a basic set of partials that we can't individually manipulate, but we use the morph knob to apply some filtering to them. So we've got two different kinds of filters. And you can see in this viewer basically which of the harmonics are being accentuated. And the section control determines the frequency range over which these two filters are applied. So you can see me basically scanning backwards and forwards through the frequency curve, highlighting the zone that this morph control is operating on. So those are my two filter shapes, and this is whereabouts in the wave those filters are being applied. Frequency modulation, as with the other engines, is going to modulate the pitch, but in a very fast, kind of imperceptible way. You can't hear the pitch being changed. It's really a tonal effect. See how increasingly complex that sound's getting as we're applying these filters, concentrating those filters on the bits of the sound, the wave. I'm just using my ears to find where these particular controls are operating best on this preset collection of partials. Liking that. Just spent a minute or so there playing with a smaller number of partials just to prove that you can actually get really nice sounds. Here we have basically 4 partials. One of them is slightly less loud than the others, but nothing wrong with that sound, perfectly usable. Next along we have a sample player. Let's load up the Dark Bells preset. Now the trick to understanding how the sampler works is to realise that there are actually 3 different versions of this sample that are going to get used, and they all have different perspectives. See, as I select each of these highlighted boxes, 1, 2 and 3, you're getting different windows on the same sample, so you can see that they're playing back different areas of the sample and they're going to sound different each time I press a key. I don't know which one of these 3 I'm going to get until I press the key. Happens to be number 3. So this is the current view of the sample that we're getting, and as this sample loops around, you can see the loop range indicated by these little arrows. The next time I press a key, we're going to get sample number window view number 1. So now nothing seems to be moving because we're looking at the wrong sample. This is what we're getting now. So each time I press a key, we jump to the next version of that view, and so they're all very slightly different. So that's the 3 different start positions of those 3 different perspectives of the same sample in the background. Now at the moment the sample's being played chromatically, so it's basically just being pitch shifted. If I disengage key, every key that I press on the keyboard will play the same sample, because it's basically just, that's the underlying sample, that's its natural pitch. Snap can be engaged and, in my opinion, should be on all the time in order to crossfade between the loop points. So wherever you set these things, this is where the sample's going to travel in its loop. And by setting snap on, it'll snap to 0 cross points, which means that when it loops around, you're always going to have a 0 point on the sample, so you won't get any kind of, artificial pop as the sample loops around. Speaking of looping, the direction is set down here, so at the moment this is just a forward only sample. Let's get number 1 going, there we go. So it'll get to the loop end and then jump back to the loop start. If I set forward and backwards, and then have to play 3 notes to get back to the same sample. So all of these settings underneath, you can see it going backwards now, they're all different for each of these views. So you can have some samples going forward only, some of them going forwards and backwards. The loop fade control determines the crossfade. As I increase this thing, can you see these windows? Basically crossfades around the loop point to make it a little bit smoother. And start determines where the playback's going to start from. So it actually started playback from this point here. So you can put the start inside the loop, that's absolutely fine. But when it loops, it'll go past that point to the manually specified loop point. So it is a very simplified version of a sample, but perfectly functional, and obviously you're very heavily reliant on the presets to give you some interesting stuff to play with. As you can see, there's a lot of samples to play with. Finally, we have the Wavetable. Let's load up the Pulsating Heart preset. What you get with a wavetable is multiple different waves. As you can see, the currently highlighted wave is this blue one. That's going to get played over and over again until you move position in the wave. Now the position doesn't inherently modulate inside the wavetable. I would have to map a modulation source to the position if I wanted to change the shape of the wave, but I can do it manually. I'll press a note. So this shape here is the underlying wave. Once again, please bear in mind that there are settings behind the scenes that are affecting this sound that over which we have no control. This is basically just like a view. These are the primary waves that we're going to interact with, but there is a synthesis engine behind the scenes that's basically tied into the preset. So this is our basic sound. As we move through the position, We strobe through each one of these different wave shapes, getting a different sound. And the trick with wavetables is to modulate through this position, but basically scan through the table, playing these waves sequentially. And wavetables are good at crossfading between all of these different waves to give you a natural transition from one wave into the next. The rest of the controls are effectively tonal, and the best way to view them is to switch to 2D mode, where whatever the wave happens to be at the moment, let's go to 2D mode, and now you see a representation of that wave, this moment in time, this position in the wavetable. Now as I start playing with some of these controls, you'll see that wave deform. Wavefolding is the idea of pushing certain frequencies until they reach maximum amplitude, and then you'll see the wave split and fold back in on itself. So here's the wave being pushed. And each time it reaches a maximum or a minimum, it splits and folds. The most important thing to bear in mind, despite the fact that it's very cool, is that you're adding extra harmonics, you're adding some sort of saturation or distortion to the sound. Effectively, it's a filter, you're changing the tone of the sound. Frequency modulation and phase distortion are very closely related. They're both about manipulating the wave in time. Frequency modulation, we directly speed up and slow down the wave. And phase distortion is a very similar kind of concept, but this time we basically kind of move the wave entirely forwards and backwards in time. That's what's happening when you phase distort. But once again, without worrying about the complexities, they're all simply tonal controls. Use them to play with to get the most interesting sound you can. A pretty great artificial sound that was nothing like the original that we started with. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.